Welcome to the second Sydney Data Stories Masterclass. We're lucky enough to have Dr. Jude Philp here today. So Jude is the Senior Curator of the Macleay Museum, where she's in charge of many, many thousands of different natural history collections and cultural materials within the Macleay collections. She's an anthropologist, and her work's founded in making connections between living people and the cultural artifacts and animals and objects that have meaning within society for them. And particularly for relevance for you guys today with Jude's work is that she's really concerned with making connections between the raw data and making them available to people, and bringing in people like you to help with that sort of a process. So I'll stop talking now. I'll hand it over to Jude, and we are very excited to hear what she has to say. Thank you, Jude.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for asking me. And not only because I look after cultural material, it has a lot of meaning to people across this country. I'd like to acknowledge that we're on Gadigal land. Many of you probably walked through Gadigal land on your way from Redfern, the largest community of Gadigal people in Sydney. Here in the Eora Nation, and I acknowledge their ancestors past, present and future. So while you were sitting waiting for the mic to work, did any of you work out how many legs in the collection?
No, I was counting.
No? Anyone want to hazard a guess even?
1.8.
1. Did you count spiders? Did you think that all insects have 6 legs? So it's a trick question, because this is the problem that we face. All of these things, at the moment, we think of insects, they're those things that have only 6 legs. But entomological collections have a number of different kinds of things, including arachnid spiders, which have 8 legs. And once upon a time, in the earliest years of the rational order system that we classify things under, crabs were also included as insects. So the problem that neatly encapsulates the problem that I have with this museum collection, because this museum collection dates back to sometimes the 1750s, lots of animals from 1790s, 1800s, and from all around the world. So problem number 1 is, well, how do you work with a group of animals that have been classified differently over 250 years? That's the biology problem. There's a geographical problem. How do you even understand where something comes from if once upon a time, New South Wales, when Alexander Macleay, who put this collection together, came out here as Colonial Secretary to New South Wales in 1826, that included almost all of Australia and Fiji and New Zealand. So New South Wales is a different place in 1826 than it is today, and it changed through time also. So that's the other problem that we have, is geographical. How do you give information to these things when 2 of the basic characteristics, what they are and where they come from, are really fuzzy? And that's the problem that basically I want to give all of you to solve, because I'm only an anthropologist and this is not my area. So I just want to give you a bit of background into what museums are, what collections are, what some of our challenges are, how people have solved them before, because there are a lot of different ways to think of very big collections like this and try and work through how to access them and how to get to them. I won't really go over the problem that you've been given, because I understand you've already been given it, and that's your problem too. That's it. It's gone. So the first public museum, and I'm talking about public museums, is the British Museum. It's founded in 1755 by an Act of Parliament. Its collections today, as you can see, are 8 million objects. In 1826, really early, the Australian Museum was founded here in Sydney, again a public museum. Saying museum at the time was a bit grand. It was a room in the post office, which itself was only 2 rooms, so it wasn't very much. But it was founded in 1826, and today it has 8 million specimens, but also objects, cultural things from Aboriginal Australia and the Pacific and Torres Strait Islanders. In 1881, because of the size of the collection, the sheer gross size of the whole, the British Museum split into 2 distinct museums. The Natural History Museum, which today has 80 million specimens, went to Kensington, And the British Museum retained its smaller set of 8 million specimens of antiquities and cultural objects. We're pretty tiny. We started in the 1790s with the collection of insects that you saw, but we opened to the public here at the university with a gift from the Macleay family of those insects in 1892. We only have 400,000 specimens and objects altogether, and 300,000 of those, as you've seen, are the insects. So it's a small and big collection, depending on what you think small and big are in the world of museums. In next year, mid-next year, we'll open in the front of the university opposite Fisher. You might have seen the big hoarding around that Fisher building. That's the Chow Chak Wing Museum. That will combine our collections with the Nicholson and the art collection. So again, we'll sort of have more things, very different things. So how do you focus people's attention and really get them to understand what it is that this collection would like to tell you, or what this collection has for your research or interests? So with such big collections, and remember the sort of numbers that we're dealing with 8 million objects, the British Museum orders everything into particular kinds of ways. And it does this, partly it's historic. Coins and medals were one of their earliest collections. They're also the sort of thing that multiplies, so you have very big numbers of coins and medals, as opposed to possibly very large sculpture or prehistory, which has a smaller set. But, you know, why do you have Africa, Oceania and the Americas and another place that's called prints and drawings? Don't they go together? So there are lots of ways that museums can sort of divide things up. Often they don't make sense, and mostly they're historical reasons. And they say a lot about what they hold dear. So that you can lump most of the world together is ethnography, but maintain a place for British prehistory or Greece and Rome. Those are very unequal kinds of divisions of the geographical world. But that's the British Museum, which says that it holds the history of all of us. That's its claim to fame. The Natural History Museum then, with its 80 million objects, structures it around the very big categories that are known from the Linnaean system: botany, entomology, zoology, paleontology, mineralogy, and interestingly, libraries and archives. It sees the documentation as one of the main collections that it holds and that it looks after. And for the kind of work that I do in the history of these collections, it is a very important archive. So the Australian Museum mimics that a little bit. It has its cultural material and its natural history material together still. It just says all stuff that's made by people, we'll just call that culture. That's just one department. And the other one is the science or natural history collections. And again, they divide up mostly into Linnaean arenas, but then with this interesting addition of frozen tissues. So this is really a department, in part, much like the budget, that's a political signal. It's saying, we do frozen tissues. We're a modern institution. We're thinking about what's happening in biology today, and we want you to know that now. It's probably a tiny collection in relation to everything else, but politically it's a very important message. So it's an entire department that they have. And we're much smaller. We're scientific instruments used by the university throughout its career, or its time since 1855, ethnography, historic photography, natural history and entomology. The reasons why cultural things, ethnography and photography, are split are simply size. There's 80,000 photographs that we have. They demand a different kind of storage system, which is often another way that things get categorised. They all get stored in the same way, so they'll go into the same place and the same kind of people will look after them. But many of the things in the photography collection relate to natural history, science and ethnography, so it's a jumble. So museums everywhere, and from their beginning with the British Museum publicly in 1755, have struggled about what their purpose is. It seems like an odd thing to say, but we have always struggled with the purpose. And the struggle is between these two distinctive, active reasons for the foundation of any museum. One is for the educational benefit of the public, the great public, whoever they may be. And the other is the research value of the specimens and objects that it looks after. So this scientific value and the cultural value of a high-end kind of knowledge, and the education for everybody, no matter whether you've ever been in a museum before. The aspiration of museums is that you will find something that A, you can understand, and B, will interest you. How do you do that? It's not an easy thing. But this was such a big problem that in 1836, the British Museum had a parliamentary inquiry that went for 2 years about what is happening with our public taxes. How can a person who's a field worker in, and I mean working in the fields, in Leeds possibly get to the British Museum to see some paintings? They're not going to get there because, as William Hutton points out, you need 3 months in advance to apply for a ticket. You need to know that you need a ticket in advance, which is not a well-advertised thing. You then get there and there's this big rigmarole, and then even if you're fairly well versed, as he was, as a historian, they're not going to tell you anything. They just expect that the objects will speak for themselves. You will learn through the magic of looking. I don't know how well that's going for you in university, but I don't advise it as a strategy, really. It's not a great idea. So it's just this little bit of information, something contextual that would enable him to use what he has, what he came to the museum with, to understand what it is that he's looking at. That was his great sadness. It ruined his entire visit to London, apparently. So and he's right, the idea that just anybody could get there when it was their taxes that were being paid was really unlikely. And with very sort of strict systems where people were following you, where you were looked down on, where there were servants. If you were a servant, you're not going to be buying a ticket. The servants are the people who serve you. All of these kinds of structures of both society and the way the British Museum worked led to this recognition that a ticketed way in was not the way to go. But similarly, the public's desire, once they did get in, to see everything, to really understand what was there and to look at all of it, meant that a lot of the specimens didn't survive the scientific study. So when you've got these giraffes, which are not live giraffes, they're taxidermy giraffes, quite a big undertaking, to split them open and stuff them and put them with armature to make them into little sculptures. Or big sculptures. But if you were interested in studying a giraffe, whatever reason, then, and they're key objects for the advancement of evolutionary ideas, this is not an ideal place to do scientific research on the top of a staircase. But this is what happened to the most prized, wondered things. They went out to the public display and to the detriment of science. There was great consternation. So how can we communicate complicated information to everyone? To make an exhibition as useful for a really specialised person who knows entomology, who's interested to know exactly what kinds of animals we might have from one specific place in the world, or what kinds of animals we have in a particular family. And it is basically a little information, as William Hutton says. It's all just in that. And unfortunately, or fortunately, that's all we do have with the entomology collection. Because as you might have seen in that first slide, the labels that are pinned with insects are tiny in themselves, about the size of my little fingernail, if at all. And they contain tiny bits of information, but that's it. There's no other book where everything was registered. There's no index list. There's no nothing. It's those labels, which are everything we know about those objects. They then connect up to archives. So I might have, or I do have, an insect from Libya, small little brown beetle, and because it had Libya and Ritchie, that's it, on the label, and because there were a lot of them that said Ritchie, Libya, all blue paper labels, Rob Blackburn, one of my colleagues, started to research and go, okay, well, we know the age of the collection, we know roughly what's happening with it. What is the likelihood that William Sharp Maclay, who always wrote on blue, got these insects from somewhere, and how did he get to Libya? We know he didn't go to Libya, so what happened? So it turned out someone who was a friend of the Lakes poets, those, you know, Ode to Daffodils chaps who lived up in the Lakes, he was convinced by Joseph Banks, the great British prospector, for want of a better word, and politician, to go to Libya as a spy to halt the Arabic slave trade, that is the trade in African slaves by Arabic people. That's what he told Ritchie. Abolition of slavery, very popular with the Lakes people and others. But what Joseph Banks actually wanted was to get to the source of gold that he knew was the money that came out of those places. So he gave it a geographical thing. He said, oh, we're going to find the source of the Nile. He gave Ritchie a purpose. Oh, you're going to solve a slave trade problem. And he actually was setting up a potential to colonise in order to be able to use the gold that would come out of Northern Africa. Ritchie was not much of a spy. I mean, you get 3 months training in Arabic in Paris and you turn up in a costume, you're not going to really fool very many people. He sadly died. His NSEX got taken by his servant, who wasn't stupid enough to go into the desert with one of the Arabic slave traders, back to Paris, which is why we have them in our collection. So Dubois then gave them to William Sharp Maclay. We now know, just because we have Ritchie and Libya, Ritchie's the guy who died, where these insects came from. We know the path. We know as far as he got before he died. So we know where they came from, beyond Libya. We know Tripoli, we know other places in Libya that is. And that's a really important story for lots of things like ecological stuff. If you've had massive civil war and unrest throughout your country, then you're going to be looking at how to reclaim things. So Timor, for instance, in East Timor, after the long years of war there with Indonesia, had people from the Australian Museum come and look at their topography and think about what insects are missing, what insects have actually just died through the process of warfare. How do you reclaim those forests? How do you make them sustainable again? Lots of eucalypt and similar kinds of geographical formations. So they worked through museum collections to re-understand what is the ecology of Timor and try and repopulate that into Timorese life so that you can build up again. So that's one of those things. Just knowing the geographical location can do this kind of work, which is really useful. But that's for the high-end researcher. So I want my high-end researcher to know I have Timorese insects or Libyan insects. And I want you to be interested in the story because, oh, I didn't know that about insects. That's quite interesting, hopefully. So this is our problem. This is the site of Chao Chak Wing Museum. This is the ground level going in, I believe, I've been told. This is what we used to look like. The Maclay Museum was built in 1892 on the university grounds. It was built by a government architect with state money and partly funded through the Maclay family who gave the collections. But one of the good things about working in this museum, although we were the entire building, we got shoved up into the attic and all our collections got squashed and squashed. Apart from that, the good thing about it is that it gives you a lot of context. You instantly think, oh, this isn't a modern museum. These things that I'm looking at must be a certain kind of age. So it comes with a box that says what it is. And that was really useful for being able to talk about the museum collections. But this is our new box. So how do we get people to see and understand some of that Victorian context in what we do? This is this is the key for me in many ways. These are this drawer is one of the Alexander Maclay drawers of insects that we have that he brought out to Australia in 1826. And what I'm really asking you to do is to tell a story about travel through the insects, to look at just that geographical location and the animal itself, and to be able to understand it. So this is a case of a very simple way of saying why it's important. Of these 4 butterflies that I've circled, which are Vanessa Cardui, only one has a label, Canisvar, which is actually spelt Kapsavar, which is a town in Hungary. Hungary has been different shapes over the last 400 years, so its borders have changed as well. It's also been involved in a number of large-scale warfare and other sorts of degradation of ecological worlds. But these butterflies are travellers. So this story is not just about, where did you come from? it's about range. It's about how many countries do these animals still manage to find in their migration patterns. These are those, you might have seen them on nature programs, these big swarms of butterflies that leave the Amazon and go out into the world, literally, and populate and then come back again. So this is about how do you make people aware of the range of the specimens, how far they go, and where these particular ones might belong. You will have seen in the data that you have that there's a lot of, doesn't seem to have a label at all, no information whatsoever. The reason for that is to do with how these collections are put together. So a drawer in an insect entomological world is your working space. This is the space in which you lay out your knowledge of your classification or your knowledge of the classificatory system, or in a scientific museum where research is done, where you might look at relationships between the animals and start to construct new classificatory ideas because things change. New knowledge comes in. So when people do that, and particularly when they did it in the past, when there are many more unknown specimens than there were known specimens, you have a small label. This is the original label here. It was folded in half, and then somebody's written another label with a new name on it. So this is one of those animals. It's got several names, a synonym and an original one. And with the capsavar one that we have, the top one's the only one with a label, because often they are the same animal. So if all of them came from Hungary, then you just write one label. You're not going to write out labels for every single one. But if you've got a collection that's over 200 years old with lots of people working on it, the chances of that thing never moving out of that drawer when somebody else's interests or purposes come into play are very slim. So sometimes the next label down that might have said that the next two were actually from Southern America has gone. That label is somewhere else. So now we just don't know about those ones. We could make a claim that they're all from Hungary, but that's not really scientifically valid. We can only really claim that one of them is. And with these, it's really difficult to say what their range is, because they could have come from anywhere in the world. So that's one of the sort of really big problems about trying to give this kind of story, visual story, to the animal, is that sometimes it's just not there. So what you do with those is one of our problems. And this is the man that caused all the problems, but also the solutions, Carl von Linné, who was a botanist and a medical apothecary at the time, Swedish, who was really frustrated by the fact that if he found a cure for a common cold and it was chamomile, he couldn't tell you chamomile will solve your cold because you might speak a different language. You're not using the same language. So he used Latin as the general all-purpose language. He's talking amongst Europeans. He decided on an ordering of things, and with the particular idea of a genus and a species and an author that ties it back to the original description. And as he says, much like the other guy, if you don't know the names of things, you don't have any knowledge. If you don't have that little information, you've got nothing. There's no purpose to it. But obviously his world in Sweden was a different world when it was 1735 to the world now. The index alphabeticus of genus is all of the insects that were thought to be. These are all the genera of insects, a very short list. And as you can see in this picture, they included lobstery crab kinds of things because they have 8 legs. So they must, they're looking at the external form of an animal to understand where it fits. But now, insects, most entomologists really just raise their hand and say, we do not know how many insects there are. We will never actually know how many insects there are. And it is really problematic. Australia has only 5% estimated of all ant species known and described. Now, if you're interested in going into mining or into ecological work, you might be hired by Rio Tinto or BP or whoever it happens to be to do a site survey. And they're obliged by the government and by international regulations to do a site survey to check that all the ecology is not going to be ruined, that you're not digging up terrible ancient things made in previous eras. but that you will look after it and you'll be responsible. That's all fine, but if you discover in your work a new species of ant, that's not counted as a stopgap because it's not known. It hasn't yet been described. You cannot say that it's the only place that you can get it, that it's in danger. You cannot legislate in any way because it has not been described. So it's a race, if you like, with current climate issues, to really be able to go and describe the varieties of animals that are out there, because we simply won't know anymore. Does it matter? Some people might go, oh, well, it doesn't really matter anyway. But if you like frogs, if you like butterflies, if you like koalas, then ants are pretty important to all of those things, and you probably want the ants as well. Anyway, this is the problem that entomologists face. They are dealing with the world's most successful species. They are everywhere and they're in big numbers. So from the very beginning, Linnaeus recognised that to deal with even his smaller group of animals and plants that he was trying to classify from the beginning, he needed a system to organise things, not just an ordering of the species themselves, but a way that a human could interact with that ordering in a systematic way. And he invented the index card. Ta-da! These are 2 index cards from the Natural History Museum in London. The one with the scribbly writing is Daniel Solander, who was Linnaeus's student. He came out to Australia with Joseph Banks in 1770 and then got a job at the British Museum classifying their collection. So this is how the system, Linnaeus's system, got instituted into our world now. There's very little difference really in what an index card did in the 1790s and what it does by the time 1957 or so comes along. So it's the same size as the Linnaean ones. It's doing exactly the same job. It's just not on flimsy paper. So both of them have a number. The main thing that's been solved in the classificatory world between these 2 cards is that a system whereby if somebody else just realises that the classification's wrong and they need to move that animal into a different genera or a different family, or, you know, crabs don't belong here, that kind of problem, then they needed new names. They needed sort of a relationship to the old name and they needed a new name. So Solander's just crossed it out and given it a new bit. But the cards of the 20th century have a way that you can have the synonyms there so that you can also start to index on the index card the different names that this particular animal might be called. And there's quite a lot of information that gets onto that. Again, if you remember that, the little label, most of this information is label based. The country and locality where it came from, the genus, the author name, quite often that's on the label who described it. That author name gives you the publication, so you don't necessarily need the publication unless you're changing the name and you need to add a new author. So it's a bibliographic reference as much as anything else. It gets you from your insect to the research paper that was written about it, or the number of research papers that were written about them. But it's more or less the same. But as Ross Perry said, if you want to automate your collections, and museums were really early in computerisation as well because of the size of collections, just in terms of how you write those index cards, you're ordering things and you're looking at things in very specific ways. You know always, oh, there, the number's there. I know what the number does and I know how to use that. I've got my head around this system. When you move an index card into a digital encoding thing, you will start to change the way that we understand and see that material. And that's one of the real problems of the kinds of work that you're involved in, is how do you meet those challenges between the ways that you're going to rupture how I understand the information and what you might feed back. So the Macleay Museum, as small as it is, partly because it's at the University of Sydney, so we can talk with people with different kinds of brains and enjoy the cross-disciplinary kinds of solutions that you come up with, was joined in a project to make the first Australian University Museum online. It was the first searchable online database, 1997. But as you can see, very limited data set, quite a lot of repetition in the data set as well. And a really difficult thing of this region code CDIJKZ. Now, it took us, I think, 4 years to find out the key to that code because all these birds had this code on it. What is the code? It's their migratory, it's their range. It's like that Vanessa butterfly. It says these are all the places that it lives, but it's really beyond the power of computers at that time and beyond a lot of people's ability to go, well, what on earth are you, what do you mean? But it was their only way to really get that in 1997 into the computer system and make it available to another user. I've just put in red the geographical fields because this is one of the problems. There are a number of ways that they've said it. This is Sydney Head. So it's kind of albatross. They never land. They're in the water. They're probably flying out of the head somewhere looking for fish, and it's got shot by George Masters. And is that Sydney? Is that still, like, where's our margin? Is that the Pacific Ocean? How do we characterise where that thing came from? And what do we mean if we say, there's an albatross we got in Sydney? If you didn't know albatross, you might think it's a kind of seagull. I mean, they're really big, so you hopefully don't, but is it a kind of seagull that I got on Sydney's beaches? Is it wandering down the middle of the thing? If you don't actually know anything about the animal, that becomes quite a difficult thing to understand. Then just 3 years later, we moved to the the Atlas of Living Australia. And this came out of the Australian Museum. So we've got, as you know, 300,070 natural history things, quite a small collection. They're dealing with millions and millions of specimens, and through connections with all of the state museums, they looked at how we're going to make this public. And it was a very fraught, very difficult and compromising kind of translation of things from one thing to another. This is page 1 of the list of the data fields. You can go online, you can see in the ALA website, there's a whole section for data and for understanding how they gather their data and how they use it. So I encourage you to just sort of look at it as a thinking thing. So this set is all about the object, the specimen. And precision is one of the main things that they really want to make sure the user will understand. Is this precise? Is it not precise? How accurate is it? And say with the albatross from Sydney Heads, if we just said Sydney, it's reasonably accurate. It's not as accurate as Sydney Heads. So most of this is about who said that that was the right name for it? Do we trust them? Yes, no? All of these kinds of ideas, qualifiers and the rest. Then there's locality, just locality. So with what their decision was, and this is, again, not followed internationally. This is, most countries try and work this out and come up with different solutions. For them, they decided, well, we've got so much vague information, we really need to just flatten that out as much as possible. And we'll do a thing where we say a centre point is a way of understanding when we don't have data. We know that it came from Australia. That's all that was written on it. Quite a few of these insects have New Holland, for instance. That's it. So they put the mark in the centre of Australia and say the degree of uncertainty that they have about that. For a person who's not an entomologist, not a biologist, I find that really weird information because quite often you'll have fish that are in the centre of Australia or certain other kinds of tropical seabirds in the centre of Australia, and you're just going, but what, why, where do they? And it takes you a while to sort of figure out the system, but it's not instantly, oh, that's the story. And that's the issue for exhibitions over research sites. Exhibitions, people wander in, maybe read something, that's it, they're done, they're out the door. So exit, unless you really capture their attention. Exhibitions really need to be clear and straightforward information that will entice you to look closely if you're interested, but will also give you something. Insects come from all around the world in this collection. That's the message people get from our study. That's fine. That's a good thing to know. We have international insects. You're now working in Mexico. You want to look at insects that came from Mexico to Australia. Okay, I know that that's got an international collection. Maybe they do. We have 6,000 insects from Cuba. Why wouldn't we have some from Mexico? So for me, it's a slight problem, the way that they solved the problem of the data, the messiness and the lack of data. And this is also geographic. This is just about the uncertainty of the data. And these are, again, they're their data fields. So only one page of the actual object of the specimen and 2 pages just dealing with geographic specificity and different practices. There are 2 references here that probably would be useful or interesting to look at down the line. So this is where most people like me will start, with Atlas of Living Australia or the Encyclopedia of Life, which is the Smithsonian Institution's thing. Enter a search term. Where do I start? I'm interested in insects. Do I start with the animal, or do I start with the place that I'm interested in? Do I say Peru? Do I say cockroach? What's going to work? And most museum sites are like this because they're not put together by data people. They're basically put together mostly by cultural people who see and read information in very different ways. So enter a search term, meant to be broad as much as you like. So if we go to the Atlas of Living Australia and you entered that search term, they're not gonna be as open as that. They're gonna guide you a bit and say, your search term needs to be geographic. Here's a list of the geographic. These are 3 different, this is a sequence of pages that you get to. So over in this section, states and territories, you choose their term. You don't have to remember how to spell Tasmania or whatever. You just choose their term. You then can say, okay, I'm in Queensland and I only want to see insects. So then you go to insects, and then maybe I'm interested in mosquitoes. And then I go across and I click mosquitoes, and then it shows me all of the mosquitoes in all of the collections that are in the Atlas of Living Australia and everywhere that they're populated. But I can keep going down to get to that insect that I'm particularly interested and see its particular distribution, which only means the places from which they were collected. It does not mean the distribution of the animal. It just means that that person got it there. And eventually it will get you to here. It will get you to a specific animal with a label, a museum, because the Atlas of Living Australia, there are a number of different museums, and it will give you information as well. It'll say, look, from here you could go out again, because there are other spaces that you could work with. It does this by text, like this one, the records. It does it by maps, charts, and through images of collecting sites. There is also, in some ways it's surprising that you get to this level, because one of the issues for any kind of natural history object is that they're highly collectible. The rarer the animal, the more likely you might have a poacher who'll come and do it. So if you declare, I got this on the corner of Abercrombie and Redfern Street, then you are telling people this is where that animal is, and you're telling poachers this is where that animal is. So there are some issues with giving away really detailed information, which is just an issue of the world. And this is the Atlas of Living, the Encyclopedia of Life. So the Smithsonian has millions and millions of animals. And it does an interesting, it says, take an animal, choose your animal first. So in this case, we've chosen this little ladybug, similar kind of thing that we get in Australia. And it gives you, okay, this is all the places that we have them from. We have 1,011 records from that coast of America. We have 3 records from the north coast of South America. And we have 30 records from up in Greenland. So you can then click on one of those. I clicked on the 3 in South America, and that takes you to the specific sites where those animals were said to have come from. They've used, I think they've used the approximation tool. They've done the centre for Oaxaca. It said it came from Oaxaca, which is a very hilly area of Mexico. So they've said, okay, just somewhere in the middle. That's where it came from. But with the 2 that came from Guyana, they've got it down to a street level. Again, that's a centre point. That street didn't exist. at the time when it was probably collected, or it might be a recent entomologist visiting Guyana and found them on the windowsill. I don't know, you'd need to sort of explore further. But that, in some ways, this is it's a straightforward kind of, this is what we have, this is where they came from, we're done. You can walk away. And that's me finished with the spiders as a reminder of how difficult it is to classify animals and to try and think of the different ways of doing so. We'll finish with a short, yes, very, very briefly. While the research that you do will go into the exhibition in Chow Chuck Wing when it opens in 2020, along with particularly a group of weevils and many shells. Weevils are lovely. There's some disco weevils in the collection. They're truly beautiful. They're just like amazing. It will go into the exhibition. You'll be able to see how well it works, how robust your analysis was. But it also is part of a Australian Research Council grant that I have with partners in Wollongong University and Melbourne University, looking at the problem that many museums face, which is this loss of data problem, that you've got a specimen, it's very, very old. It's probably the first one that was ever in the country, and it's the one that, you know, the type all international reference is based on, but you don't know which one of those 5 kangaroos it is because they've all lost their labels, and we didn't have a register then, and we don't use the index cards, and they didn't have numbers, and many, many different reasons. It's not an unusual story for museums to lose data. So we're trying to use archives and records and our knowledge of the stories in how these animals travelled to reapply information to them. So being able to see a distribution of where the insects came from is also a distribution of a network of natural history collectors that Alexander Macleay, William Sharp and William John all worked on in order to be able to amass all of that collection throughout a whole century. So that map, as much as it might be an attractive thing to look at in the exhibition, is also a signal of research and understanding of how that collection came together and what the world was known as from the 1790s through to the 1870s. There you go.
Well, thank you, Jude. That was absolutely fascinating as per normal with you. If you haven't watched Jude's Sydney data stories on the website, I highly encourage it. It's absolutely fascinating as well. But you have the researcher here for the data set that you are working on. So hopefully either from this talk or around the data, you might have some questions. We've got about 10 minutes left. So does anyone have any questions for Jude? Yeah. Hang on, we've got the microphone box so that everyone can hear what's going on. So there we go.
Yeah. So, just on what you said about like finding the backstory behind that like Libyan data insect, could you talk a bit more about what that process was?
That was so part of it. Oh.
Sorry. Normally we have 2 microphones. There we go.
I'm not good at throwing and catching either. So part of it is knowledge of collections. Collections follow patterns, really. You know, someone's working away, they do the same thing over and over again. William Sharp writes on blue paper. No one else seems to have used blue paper. That gave us a date line of his life, William Sharp, when he was active. Libya and Tripoli, Ritchie, they gave, Google's wonderful. You put in Ritchie and Tripoli, and because there was a connection to the Lakes poets, someone had written a book about the dinner that the Lakes poets had given Ritchie on his farewell. So up it came. Ritchie's connected to these people. His dates then match William Sharp's dates. So it's a process of understanding the collection, how it was put together, clues, then going out further and further and further. Once we had Ritchie and he worked with William Sharp Macleay, and we then got to the Tripoli part of it through the dinner, because the speeches of the dinner were given in this book, so you knew that that's where he was going, that that's what he was asked, that he had this long felt desire to do good in the world and to rid it of the scourge of slavery. And then the hardest thing was to understand how we got the insects. So because we knew Ritchie went out and we knew he died, And we knew that William Sharp Maclay was in Paris at the right date, but how did he get the insects? And it wasn't until Rob started to follow any of the reports that he could of the actual disastrous trip that Dubois, the servant, came into play, that Dubois went with them, that he left at a certain date, and that he traded animals with the Natural History Museum in Paris, gave us our solution. So that's what it was. It was partly relying on the research of others, partly relying on what we know about the collections. And a lot of those are like that you can point at an animal and you'll find something remarkable about it, generally.
Other questions? Yeah. Thank you. How confident?
So when you mentioned that you might have to like reclassify all the classifications done by, people maybe hundreds of years ago of certain insects, is there like an ethical concern that the way that those insects were classified, say 200 years ago is sort of history in itself, as in like a history of entomology that you might be then not necessarily destroying, but altering, if that makes sense?
Thank you. Yes. So we're one of the few museums in the world. The Hunterian Museum in Glasgow is another one where we retain the pinnings, as they're called, this weird group of animals just sitting in a drawer in no particular order or particularly well conserved. This we preserve today. You can open this drawer and it still looks like this, because for us, as a history museum as well as a museum of science, we have one of the few collections that gives us a history of taxonomy itself, of the ways that people struggle to understand this system and to work through this system. If we were the Australian Museum, and we're very lucky that there is such a fantastic museum next door, we would be synonymising to our heart's content and just reworking the specimens and getting them into new order and making it all work. And that's what entomologists generally do time and time again. Partly because we don't have an entomologist, so these are museum collections. That has meant that the collection has been able to stay as it is and not be changed in the way that many other collections were changed. But even if it did change, and this is the problem, you could rework it because the labels never get moved from an insect. You just add more. Get these little high stacks of labels, tiny little printers. Now with the ability to actually physically number specimens, barcode, however you do it, you can start to do the synonymies on the digital version rather than interfere with the pinnings themselves. You can find them. But for many collections throughout the world today still, Queensland Museum Bird Collection, which is a couple of million birds, it's still ordered on taxonomic lines. They haven't digitised that collection to say number B73295 is in drawer 739 and you can just go to that, or to search on albatross. They still rely on a curator who knows her taxonomy really, really well. And if I'm going for petrel, she'll go to the albatross section, she'll look at the specimens that I'm interested in. So to get from her kind of work to the Atlas of Living Australia is really hard because it's immense amounts of work.
We probably have time for one more question if there's anyone else out there. Yeah, at the back here. Ready?
Yeah, sorry. Purpose of a museum.
Get fit doing this, won't I? There we go.
So most museums have a charter that gives them their purpose. Our charter is, we're established for the purpose of teaching and research at the University of Sydney and the Linnaean Society of New South Wales. That's our purpose. So that's why I'm here, teaching. That's why they're there, because we've done some research. That's got some taxidermy in it, little wires and things. That's basically it. To that, the university has extended a more general museum purpose of active participation in the world, if you like, extending the ability to show and to display that knowledge for educational and entertainment purposes to the great everybody. And that's, museums now are still struggling with this problem between research and education and attractive sort of something to do stuff. New Zealand, stunningly, recently in one of their museums, they have no longer any research on their natural history collections. They have dispelled that because they say the main job that we need to do is to work to educate the public through our exhibitions, and that's all we'll do. So they had a charter to be a scientific research institution, and they said, no, we can't afford to do that anymore, we're going to change. The Australian Museum still does both. It has a very good relationship with the University of Sydney in order to be able to get access to high-level, very fine areas of research that enter into the natural history world. People work on a single animal, not necessarily a group of animals, or today people work on DNA strands, so not even being as aware of what the physical animal might look like as they did in the past. But that relationship allows the research to continue in a really active way, while they can also concentrate on the public aspect of the exhibition and work with people to search and discover the natural world.
Great. Thank you, Jude.
That's
Thank
Kate.
you, everybody. That was some great questions.